Hey everyone, we are excited to launch the Bright Mind subscription. Unlimited access to all of our CE courses, webinars, and expert speakers all in one place.
And for a limited time for the month of December, you can get 50% off. Normally $299 a year, now just $149 for your first year.
That's unlimited CE on your schedule for half price.
Head over to psych2practice.com and click sign up, and the discount is already applied. We look forward to seeing you there. And as always, be well, stay psyched. This episode of the Psych to Practice podcast is sponsored by PAR, where psychological assessments meet innovation.
PAR has been the gold standard in the industry for over 45 years and has empowered professionals in education, healthcare, private practice, and research with trusted tools and cutting-edge solutions.
Discover more at parinc.com. Again, that is parinc.com. Creating connections, changing lives. Hello and welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and while Ray isn't here with me, we have a repeat visitor and someone who is actively a part of the Psych to Practice family here, Dan Florell. So Dan, thank you for jumping in as Ray for tonight.
I will be Ray's proxy right now. I will channel Ray as best I can.
Awesome. I certainly appreciate it. It's some big shoes to fill. Confident you have the ability there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, and I guess my trying to shoehorn this in, and man, I'm just doing a lot of shoe-based puns now, but talking about wearable technology and kind of the role that can play, especially in mental health for today. And I know, Dan, you've been doing some recent research on that, but also wanted to just kind of feel like a conversational piece here to talk about like what role we foresee it in, and then kind of maybe what does some of like the research kind of actually suggest that it can be used for, and then maybe some of the how do we make the most out of it, but also what are the concerns we need to be aware of?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start with a story of what inspired me into the wearables, other than you hook me up to any sort of technology and I'm all for it. Just try it out anyway, especially if it's on myself. It's kind of like the mad scientist, I guess. Always try it on yourself first, and then you don't have to worry about things like privacy and all that. So I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, I ran across this little study about that Syracuse University had done with blood pressure monitoring wearables, which really was for people who'd had heart attacks, but they put it on as a student or a child. I guess they must have been 12, 14 that had autism spectrum disorder, but very low, high severity level, nonverbal. And at their age and size, they became kind of a danger for those that were working around them when they had outbursts, because they weren't really, the providers and aides weren't really able to spot when that individual was getting upset. And so when they put this blood pressure on monitor, they were able to figure out within a minute, and they even estimated they may get up to 2 minutes of advance warning before this child would have a outburst. And so the enterprising folks that were doing this research decided to go ahead and create an app that when the alert goes out, then everybody gets a push notification that this child's beginning to get real upset. And it even linked it to previously discussed de-escalation procedures for that child. So, 2 minutes doesn't sound like a much, but if you are the aide in that room, you get the alert, you quickly draw up, what were the de-escalations for this particular child. You may still be able to even get to them before that 2 minutes is fully up. And then now you're not evacuating the room. Now you're keeping all the other children in that classroom safe. And I was like, this is totally cool. It's like, you have your own crystal ball and being able to spot when something's about to happen and being able to prevent it. And so there led me down a rabbit hole. And now I, got a ton of articles and been doing a little research on it. Not quite that population, but that was the inspiration behind it. I mean, obviously, I can't remember the exact authors, but I mean, I remember the study to this day and just intrigued by the possibilities.
I mean, that's such like, I don't know that I've heard it framed as that, like it's a crystal ball, but like, and even in, our some conversations leading up, I don't know that I had it in that sense until you just said like, just the ability to predict and just that the value that that can hold in the either preventative or, just in improving care. And so, not only for those individuals in the room, but I imagine that individual, who's on the spectrum, like if they're able to kind of help provide that support, how that can feel a bit more connective, how that can feel a bit more just supported in a way versus the language barriers there and those pieces of like, well, I mean, they're just providing better care, at the end.
Talking about kids that, are lower functioning like that and don't have verbal means of displaying what their needs are. I mean, it could even be interpreted as a way of feeling like they're heard better than before they have to get into that mode of really blowing up, and not being able to handle whatever the situation is. And so on many levels, just that particular population. And I think the other intrigue and real challenge in this whole wearables thing is it is physiological data. So, the medical world's been in this for quite a long time, as I was saying, like heart attack victims and others. They wear these monitors of various sorts and have for quite a long time to make sure, people aren't putting themselves at higher risk for the physical problems. But I was intrigued by, because there are some certain signatures physiologically of maybe mental states. And so could this be used in a similar manner that we're seeing it already used in the medical world for more physical health issues?
And, what I find really interesting, like, so as we're talking, I have an Apple Watch, if I'm kind of calling the brand out here. Yeah. And
don't we all?
Yes. And in that, that heart rate monitoring piece of it, and how even with that, I know that there's times where I will get, it's a specific alert. I think it's if I'm over 10, like if it's over a certain duration of time when it doesn't detect a lot of other physical activity of an elevated heart rate. And, there's times where I'm like, well, this is just concerning because I'm not doing anything that feels all that stressful. And like, so what's going on? But more often than not, I'm in, a pretty heavy or intense session of like, things are feeling like, it's challenging, or I myself am experiencing a lot of anxiety or worry about a specific situation or circumstance. And so just the intuitiveness and the way that it can better integrate, because there might also be those times when we're, when we, going back to if we're testing ourselves, it can bring awareness when we might not have recognized, or it might not have been necessarily seen. As I called out, there's some of those times of, I'm just sitting here pretty relaxed. What's going on with my heart rate kind of concerns there. Again, physiological data, is my watch resting, fully? Is it able to capture that fully? Or so the data itself, wanting to be mindful of that, but just the ways that it can implement, just collecting data and the role that can play, I think is really valuable. And, I think in the sessions, I often talk with individuals, like whether it's we're doing mood scales or things like that, and just the opportunity of collecting a different level of data is, pretty intriguing.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I mean, in your example, you're basically talking about like a biofeedback mechanism, which of course we've had in psychology for a very long time. But now we're empowering people to be 24/7 with a passive monitoring device that's able to pick up and give you warnings that, hey, your heart rate's elevated. Or in the case of me, when I'm doing my workouts, it's, hey, your heart rate's dropped. And I'm like, yeah, I got to rest for a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. It's even better when you link it through. The other day, I linked it through my, my music I was listening to was on my phone. And so it would break in way too often to go like, your heart rate is down below your 130 or whatever. And I'm like, you are cruel.
Yeah. I hear you. Yeah. Well, and collecting data in that sense, but also one of the things that, and I'm sure it's taking quite a bit of different physiological data and distilling it down, but the sleep scores or sleep reportings and how active are we during that time. And I know oftentimes that is a time when individuals charge wearable technology, but recently, well, I don't know, I didn't think of it beforehand, but I've upgraded one version since I initially kind of broke into the wearable technology. So I have an older Apple Watch and had the awareness of, I should just wear this one when I sleep. And so now I have the charges throughout the day and throw it on at night. And even though it has a bit of a cracked screen, it doesn't really matter all that much. And, it's not cracked enough, I'll cut myself. And now I'm getting some, more often than not, it's hey, you didn't sleep the best tonight, make sure you're getting to bed better. But even that awareness and that little push notification piece, I think can be helpful, because it's something that it's brought it more to mind now that I have that data. And so, with data, we can then interpret it and then use that. We don't have to, but we have the opportunity to versus just self-report or memory alone, and which can be quite fallible.
And now a word from our sponsor. PAR's AI Report Writer is an AI-boosted tool that generates comprehensive reports, including interpretations and recommendations based on scores from a wide range of popular assessment tools. Spend less time on report writing and more time supporting students. Learn more at parinc.com/AI. That is parinc.com/AI. And now back to our conversation.
Well, as a psychologist who depends on multiple sources of data, not only have I been monitoring my sleep for quite a while using my Apple Watch, which of course it's great because it also shows how many times you awoke at night. It does a little bit where it says it gets into your stages of sleep. It gets a little more dubious the more you get further into the detail. But the second source of information is my way too expensive mattress. And the mattress is hooked up to an app that will then tell me how many hours of sleep and how I've met up with it. And so it's interesting to look at the two sources of data, right? And to see how consistent. Unfortunately, they both concur that I am not getting enough sleep, which, as I get my hit of caffeine in about mid-afternoon is no mystery to me. I realize that. But, I've become obsessed to some degree about the sleep issues. When I was working in the schools, they frequently would have on their developmental questionnaire, right, does your child sleep well? And what they had was simply a Y or an N. And if it was N, they gave you maybe a line to explain why. And I feel like so much is missed when we try to ask that way. If I had my druthers, any assessment that we would ever do, I would hand them like a Fitbit, an Apple Watch, a Whoop, something like that, and say, hey, wear this for 2 weeks. I want to see what the child's or what the adolescent's sleep patterns really are. And, I don't blame the parents at all for not being able to be accurate. I mean, I know my kids wouldn't have liked me going up into their room, waiting for them to fall asleep and then staring at them for a while to see if they wake up in the middle of the night or, are they really asleep? I mean, nobody does that. They just have a guess. Like I sent them up to the room at this time and then I went and woke them up at this time. So I guess they're getting 9 hours of sleep. Well, maybe they aren't going to sleep right away or they're having a difficult time or they wake up in the middle of the night, can't fall asleep for a half hour. I mean, all of these variables that can point to poor sleep, that's the big magnifier. I like to say, not enough sleep magnifies everything wrong with you.
Absolutely.
Right. And so the good news is we don't need an advanced algorithm AI to necessarily interpret how long we're sleeping. I think that's a fairly basic underlying physiological thing. But even just knowing that as a therapist or as somebody who's doing assessments, I think really goes towards at least a whole avenue that a lot of times maybe we don't address as well because we never get good data on that sleep. So even if you say my mattress may not be the most effective in telling me how many hours of sleep I've gotten, it's still better than me. Like me telling you, other than say I'm tired, but I went to bed at such and such time. I think I woke up a couple times. I wasn't sure. I have now other data that can kind of reinforce my general sense of things.
And I know that some of access to some of these things can be, there's various barriers there. I'm intrigued by this smart mattress. I was trying to think of something funny or punny to talk about with it. It's not wearable, it's longible technology, but
they actually have a phrase for it. I believe it's nearables. So you are not, it is not attached to you. You are not wearing it, but it is near to you and is catching the data. So the mattresses, say you have a camera that was focused on you and picking up on sleep patterns, something like that. But that's a whole other category, or as my undergrads were referring to it as creepy. But I think there's some utility too. So let's say you have somebody, I've heard many people, because I'll say, oh yeah, I wear my wearable at night, my smartwatch, and they're like, I just could never do that, right? There are people, or there's some that have sensory issues and they're like, no, I couldn't have that on my skin while I'm trying to sleep. So Nearables may be, and there's some other things. It's not just a mattress. There's some where you can slide a pad under your bed, under your bedding, and then it picks up on some of that measurements. You could even think of a Nearable for a lot of the bedwetting.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of shaping, right? There's sensors that can sense if a child usually is wetting the bed, and then it kind of gives them a little bit of an alarm to increase the awareness. So, there's utility with Nearables, and it can play a role. Though I'm with my student, it does sound a little creepy.
Creepy but functional, yeah.
Yeah, it could be very functional yeah. With that.
But I'm struck by that thought of just even coming back. If we do have the opportunity to kind of explore some of these pieces, I think it becomes a bit of a bridge in conversation with individuals. And so I know I've probably been doing it for about 2.5 months now, of like had my other watch an embarrassingly long time and it was just sitting in a drawer, but was going to go to recycle it and thought, you know what? This still has some function and use here. And it had come up just randomly, like in session, I was talking with an individual and they shared how they just hadn't been sleeping the best. And I was like, oh, like, if you ever do it, like, I was like, if you ever have an extra Apple Watch, they wore an Apple Watch. I was like, you can get a sleep score, like sleep score. And so then like talking about that, and even if it's just like this distilling down type of idea of like, we don't have to know every aspect of data, but if we can get it, it's just a summarization of what did we sleep, and 0 to 100 in that way. And then what is a good sleep score, what is an okay sleep score. Frustratingly, I get more at a low sleep score than I'd like, but it's that type of thing where once I've then been exposed, I can then work to inform of like what's the function or role that can play when it's appropriate and when individuals are kind of seemingly receptive. But since then, I think I've seen him twice since then. He's been excited to come in and tell me what his sleep score is. And we talk about like, okay, well, what is he doing? And like just that act of like, again, collecting his own data with it. And he's now, taking this on. So I think it's something that can be, it doesn't have to be necessarily something we push or focus on, but when it can just come up naturally in conversations. And I think since then, when I hear sleep, and if I see someone happens to be wearing wearable technology, I might then ask that, might be more open to asking that. And I will say, I know we're talking a lot, or I'm referencing a lot with the Apple Watches, but I do believe now kind of emerging even more so with that specific type of data collection. I hear is like smart rings and things of that nature there as well.
Yeah, auras.
Yes. And I think that's quite interesting, but an individual who's married, I'll wear my wedding ring at night, and it's gotten second nature that I don't even remember, where I might bang my watch on something, or like I might even kind of feel that. Like, so I know that there's individuals that have been taking advantage of that as a potential, when you're talking about that sensory piece, granted price barrier there, but again, if someone has it, I want to encourage how do they get as much function or use out of that as possible.
Well, I think about the bridge that it creates. One of the issues that when I was doing more counseling with adolescents and trying to get their perceptions of things, how are you sleeping? Or you may even older clients, right? How are you sleeping? Oh, fine. I have some issues. But, it's really what they're thinking is how I slept last night. They're not thinking about maybe a week pattern. And so rather than spend a lot of time trying to get it narrowed down, having the app there and then using it as a bridge to talking about, well, what about sleep hygiene and how is the anxiety or the ADHD impacting the sleep, and how can we maybe go about calming your brain down? Like with ADHD, you hear a lot about, the racing thoughts and just things kind of blipping in and out. And with anxiety, it's the more nagging worries. And each one might lend itself to a different type of intervention to calm them down. But then one of the outputs may be, now I'm falling asleep faster, so I get longer periods of sleep. Because a lot of times, especially with ADHD, it's if you can get them down, then they're out like a light, they're solid sleepers. Yeah. And so it's really like, how can we make sure they're not up for the 3 hours tossing and turning before that brain finally kind of slows down enough to allow it to sleep? And so once again, outward kind of just the old biofeedback, you're getting immediate data on your efforts. And that can also be motivational. It sounds like what it was for your client to, be able to come in and of course with their permission and all the privacy concerns, that go along with it. But, especially if a client's able to bring it in on their own and show it to you, but there's even programs that will even forward it to other loved ones, caretakers, providers for that, which also can be very empowering because, you could glance at what their physio data is telling you even the 2 minutes before they come in as part of your prep for the client. And then you could be in the back of your mind, say, okay, that's something we can bring up as we get a little further in that, there's these concerning signs, or even though they're complaining, you can say, well, this does seem to be doing better. Let's talk a little bit about the positives and progress in addition to, the challenges that you're having.
Absolutely. And one of the other pieces, and you were talking just about the immediate feedback, and the other, I think, benefit that comes along with at least wearable, like thinking about the smartwatches, are the executive functioning support. And so I, again, call it out, the brand Apple Watch, the stand reminders, like the 50 minutes of the hour, it's like, hey, you haven't stood for 1 minute. It's like, okay, well, would I have been attentive or aware enough to meet that goal? And while might seem kind of silly, making sure I'm getting some of that physical movement, or that push reminder of, hey, you this much check, this amount of time for you to close your rings. It's like, okay, let me go and do some of those pieces. But also I think the benefits that come along with if it's a calendar alert reminder. So I oftentimes when I'm setting in a reminder, I try to put the location, and then I get the benefits of it. It'll give me that little pop-up of what's the expected traffic like, and the anticipated traffic patterns. I might not be always near my phone. And so that little of hey, I should probably get ready to leave soon can be quite effective and helpful there, of just making sure that I'm not running late, or those pieces. And also if it's, hey, I'm setting a reminder for, being able to have that countdown timer of, hey, I need an hour to go by before I go and change the laundry around. But where I'm sitting at, I don't, if I set my phone down or something like that, might not be there, and it might just be going off for a while. But, my watch will start buzzing, and, if I have my headphones in, it'll start dinging, and that's I need to go and get the laundry. Granted, I still need to actually go and do that, but it just increases, it's one more opportunity to potentially do those things. And
yeah,
the one other.
Well, I was just going to go, I think the difference between a wearable and a smartwatch, where a wearable is much more of a physio oriented, and a smartwatch is like a combination of your phone on your wrist and, the physio. It's it's a 2-in-1 device. Imagine that. And what you're talking about, is a lot of these push alert kind of things, capabilities that I'm a huge fan of. I mean, there are reams of journal articles that have come out on the effectiveness on text reminders, right? Just in time interventions is another really big one that the wearable literature talks about, where, we're able to intervene in the moment, that the quote teachable moments that we've always talked with parents about, that, in the therapeutic setting, in the counseling setting, we don't have as many teachable moments because we're not putting them in putting them out there to have to institute their social skills or something. And so it's interesting with these push alerts that they're coming at a time when that push alert's not going to do you any good when it reminds you in 2 hours that you need to do something, right? The thing that's really important is it gives you an alert, and you have 2 or 3 minutes to act, or you're going to be late to wherever you go. And so, that's real powerful. That's why you now, for almost every medical appointment you get, right, you're getting push alerts, and you get push alerts for other things too, almost to the point where you got to be careful with them, because my New York Times subscription gives me push alerts. Do I need that to be a push alert? Probably not. And the problem that you can run into is the habituation to the alerts itself. If I'm getting inundated, like my university has, emergency alerts, I get more tests of the emergency alerts than I ever get emergency alerts. Thank heavens. But it's starting to get where if I see that number, I just automatically, I'm like, oh, I'm sure that's just a test, right? And you begin to ignore it. So Yeah, and the same thing for the wearable. Like when I'm supposed to stand, it's always the same 2 beeps. And so if you feel those 2 beeps, you're just like, oh, there's 10 minutes. Okay. And it's almost barely on awareness because you've just learned to habituate to it. So there's a little bit of danger, like only try to be judicious in your usages of it, which could be another topic, right? When you're in the counseling session, if people, because boy, every app really wants to make you and give you push alerts, even if it is to that, Whopper being on sale at Burger King.
Absolutely. And when you first download the app is a crucial time of, do I want notifications for this app? And, you can always go back into settings and, usually alter those. But, if I'm trying to pick up a food or, hey, do I really need a Popeyes app? Like,
Yeah.
I do enjoy me some, love that chicken from Popeyes, but I don't know that I need it. I don't know that I need it on my phone.
Sometimes we don't need those guilty pleasures. I don't usually need to be reminded of those. Those are front of mind way too often.
But one of the other pieces, and I'm grateful that you kind of made that distinction between, a smart device versus just the wearable technology. And I think oftentimes now the smart devices are trying to integrate that wearable tech to capture that physiological data. Not always, but I think more and more it's just kind of seen as if it has the opportunity to, can it be a bit of that all-in-one piece? But this is, I guess, more of the smartwatch notifications. But when you can integrate that for, again, I'm going to use the health app from the accompanying health app for the iPhone, but I have notification alerts for medication. And truly, if I'm speaking honestly, I don't actually go in and mark down that I've taken them. I have a different method for being able to track that. Mm-hmm. However, I have it set up in an annoying enough way where it's like right before I usually should leave for work, which is really when I want to take my medication, just so that way I'm leveraging it the most that it can. And I just get the little buzz. And when you're talking about that habituation, that is one that, certainly it's just kind of like, I know what I need to do. But if I'm not acting in that moment, it is really frustrating to leave. And then I'm just like, oh man, I forgot my ADHD medication. And like now I'm what am I going to do? Like, how do I handle that? So trying to kind of set up those systems so that they're a bit more effective. And I can't recall if I shared, but part of my ADHD medication has been showing some higher blood pressure. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to start testing this. My doctor asked me to send over some. And the first few nights when I was just going to try, or I was just going to remember, not the most effective, but I set up those reminders, and then, I have my watch buzzing and yelling at me as I'm trying to fall asleep. It's like, hey, didn't take your blood pressure. Okay. So, getting the cuff out and doing those pieces, just the benefits it has there for us to one more opportunity to follow through with things as intended and supporting individuals. I think all individuals can benefit a bit from executive functioning tools, but I know, especially the population that I work with most with ADHD really can use it. But the digital literacy necessary to make sure that we're not inundated, because that blindness can certainly occur quite fast.
Yeah, well, but I think to your point, Paul, that's where the therapist can play a role in the support, right? I'm sure with a lot of your clients, for every tool there is, that's an added complication to what they're already having a hard time tracking. And so, there's a lot to be said for you having a guide to walk you through, We call them our kids if it's electronics usually. And showing us, especially social media, right? To tell us like, what is this TikTok? How do you get on here? And, but as a therapist who's specializing in like executive function is like, okay, we have the time here. And this time, while we're not directly talking about your ADHD, we're going to problem solve to hopefully get these devices to where they're optimized to be the most effective for you. And then we're going to get rid of all the noise that a lot of these generate and be able to, whether that's on your computer having a focus time, where your word processor blocks out every other thing that wants to keep your attention so that you can just focus on the one thing. And so, in some ways as therapists, we need to be at least competent digitally in some of these devices and find out how much, our clients are using the devices and if they even know what they all do. I got to tell you, when I was doing research, and name drop here because the research we did was using Apple Watches because they are probably one of the most used brands. And it's amazing what data, physiological data, those are collecting and that we probably aren't even aware of. When we were getting our participants, one of the things that the participants really liked out of it, and we were forcing them to give it, well, not forcing them, they volunteered to give the data for 2 weeks, right, that they had to wear their Apple Watches. But in the end, we gave them kind of a breakdown of what we were measuring and what their data kind of was telling, not necessarily about them, but just their patterns. And by large, we weren't able to afford to pay them, but they were just appreciative of like, wow, I didn't even know my watch could do that sort of stuff. So how many clients are wearing stuff that could be maybe really useful for their being able to kind of navigate whatever challenges they have by using some of that data, and kind of getting to your also another point, because you have your gross scores of like how you're sleeping every night. But when you use something like the Apple Watch over, I want to say it's a longer period of time, like 3 full months, then you now start getting further kind of trend data on your overall health. So you can say, like, hey, is my heart rates at night, oh, that's actually increasing. I wonder why that is, over a 3 or 4 month period. So while it is great for even just daily stuff, there is longer term things if you get with consistency. And I think that points to some of the promise of these wearables that, longer term, they can spot trends. And so one of the things we talked about before we started recording was just a prevention kind of mindset of being able to be fully aware or more aware earlier than when you would have normally picked up on it about things maybe reoccurring. So anxiety creeping back into your life, depressed mood sneaking in, or mania, wouldn't it be great to have just an advanced warning mechanism? And it can be spotted by these trends, just like if you get your blood tested every year when everything's okay, then your doctor's going to have that much more to be able to interpret accurately what a spike in something and goes, well, you tend to spike this time, or this has always been a little bit high. So it's not really like some big warning sign that I would have if I didn't have 10 years of your blood data, So I just think that's another aspect that when we talk about wearables that maybe we don't fully think about or appreciate in the same way.
And not that this had certainly a mental health impact, but I'm reminded back, not in the very, very beginning, but fairly early on in COVID, I know that there was some like integration where if you reported that you had COVID and, you updated your device, that it would then, you had to give all sorts of permissions, but it would then be able to detect who, what are other devices you are nearby to then be able to commit, or to potentially transmit, and giving them that early warning piece of it as well. So, that's certainly more of a physical health component, but, if there's worry or concerns of like, okay, is that a tool that I could use to say, okay, hey, is this something that's happened for me recently? Or even, I believe that there's a social, this is the ADHD element of the misplaced items, and then being able to get some of the pings from like an AirTag or things of that nature there from others' devices. And so not only, we can potentially passively impact other individuals' well-being as well. And so I know that there was an individual who, because I guess my iPhone was nearby, it pinged one of their lost earbud or something like that. And they were like really grateful. They're like, oh, I dropped in, must have dropped in session. I didn't know where it was. And, it showed up initially on their Find My, and not because of, I guess, my phone tried to connect to it in that way. So, wearable technology, I think, just can also have a social connectedness. And I don't quite know all of the functions, but you're talking about the physiological data that it connects. I have to imagine that there's also the proximity data of various things that it can be aware of as well.
Well, yeah, but I guess, that gets into a little more.
That's
where that takes us, right, is the concern about privacy and the privacy of a lot of this data, and the physiological data in particular is, a very concerning aspect, because it's a lot of data. It's a lot of very personal data, and how much you want to be sharing of that. As far as locations, they even had a whole social network called Yik Yak, I believe it was called, that would notify you when people were close by. And I guess Snapchat, right, had a way of tracking your Snapchat friends. So in some ways, I guess there's wearables in that way. But when we start talking about those sociable ones, I think people begin to get a little unnerved, because that also means maybe a little too close of tracking with that. Depending on how, the original people with those companies, I think, viewed it as a common good. But then quickly, people who used it figured out, well, there's a dark side to it. And I think that's true of any technology. I think some of this wearables, so that if everybody had access to it and things that could be used, like, for example, insurers, could that insurance, use wearable data to not cover you or something, or to charge higher premiums, and so there's that side of things. And so I think having those conversations with clients, if they are open to that. And then I think the other thing that we talked about is, even is the product something that we should trust as far as its output and its reliability? Now, we've been referring to Apple Watches quite a bit. And from what I've seen in the literature, they are pretty good for a consumer product. And I think that's a big thing to kind of italicize. Yeah. So, none of the things I think we've talked about today is what we would call lab grade material. It is not absolutely accurate. And that's what's always intrigued me about consumer wearables is, yes, I wouldn't want to go ahead and diagnose a heart defect based on just my consumer. But if I got a warning from my consumer one about a possible heart defect, I may pay pretty close attention to it, and I would look to go in and get that lab grade kind of to make absolutely sure yay or nay. So it's almost like a way of screening that is pretty accurate, but there are certainly, depending on the wearable that is being worn, defects or lack of accuracy is probably a better way of framing it. And just being a little bit careful about going too overboard. So do I trust my mattress implicitly that it has 100% accuracy on my sleep? Not really. Yeah. But I think it gets me in the ballpark. And sometimes ballpark it's way better than self-report. So I'm looking at what are the alternatives if I didn't have that? And the alternatives are relying on self-report data, which is never nearly as accurate, or going in for a sleep study, which is way too expensive and not something I'm going to do every night. So, I think understanding where this fits within kind of the whole realm from self-report to being in a high-end medical facility. And the closer we can get maybe to the medical facility, but not have all the restrictions that a medical facility would have as far as, if you've ever seen a sleep study, the people, look like they're hooked up with all the electrodes and stuff. And if you thought people had trouble sleeping with a wristwatch on at night, that cap full of connections is certainly not going to help.
Absolutely. And so I like that we should be treating it both as a ballpark and I think also as a screening tool. If it gives us that warning, it doesn't mean it's, for sure. In the same way, if I administer a Vanderbilt, that's not a definitive ADHD diagnosis. It's just saying, okay, are we seeing a trend in behaviors here? And is it a cue that maybe go and seek, further testing or further results? And so from whomever the professional is.
Yeah. Well, and to some extent, we're talking about really high-tech, expensive smartwatches. But I got to tell you, once again, you're around me. I'm hooked up to so many wearable devices on a regular basis, but I wear a pedometer on top of wearing an Apple Watch, and I have for years. And these pedometers are, they're $10. And yet you can even get data from that. Like the one I have, I don't know, maybe it was $30, but it'll track 7 days worth of data. And your activity level can certainly play a huge role when we try to intervene with depression, knowing how effective physical activity and movement is. That's not nearly as complex. And when we talked, I think you talked a little bit about accessibility earlier on when we were chatting. That's a much more accessible kind of wearable, and it's not as fancy, but it still gives us valuable data that maybe we wouldn't have had otherwise. And so, I get caught up in the smartwatch kind of thought processes when I talk about wearables too, but there's certainly easier, low cost, still wearables that give us some decent data.
And I'm grateful you brought that up, just because I think that is such an important piece of it's not all necessarily the high tech components of it. And, we do have those, still wearables. It still is a technology, but just, it doesn't have to break the bank, nor does it have to do everything all in one. If there's a specific piece of information we're looking for, is there a way to just gather that and, the value that simplicity can bring along with it. And now I'm thinking of going probably the complete opposite direction of simplicity. And my thought goes to, I don't have any personal experience with this other than maybe the personal assistant on my phone would maybe count as this somewhat, but the smart devices that, if it's a pen that you're clipping onto your shirt or something along those lines, that is kind of acting as an intermediary for an LLM. And so for note collection, or I know that there's wearable devices such as the Meta glasses, where it's actually a camera that's recording information that's there, and just again, plethora of information. But as we collect more and more, those privacy concerns, I think, go up more and more as well. And that's something, I've been hearing quite a bit about as well. But there's individuals that I know that, they use those, like, hey, I have my AI device that listens in on all my meetings, my in-person meetings. So that way I have a recording down, and it's not just a recording I have to go back and sift through, but it's collecting notes for me, and it's the takeaways and improving productivity in that way, or being able to it's the Google on the fly, but Google with more answers of like, hey, like, what is this? Or like, how do I do this? And like getting a bit more step-by-step directions. And I want to say, not that it was Wearable, but Dan, I think it was you way back when we attended PodFest together. I believe you talked about having an earlier, like one of the more advanced versions of ChatGPT, and being able to point it at something, and just the way that it's able to identify something. I think that was a part of our conversation, or maybe I'd come up with it. And I think
it still exists to some degree. As you've been talking about it, though, what I'm intrigued by, and what I think there should be a differentiation, is personal recording wearables and sociable recording variables. And I don't mean sociable necessarily positively. I'm saying that, like, if I make a decision to do something and I want to share data about myself, my body, my functioning, you go to it, right? That's yours to give. But the moment that you start recording me, like you are right now, of course, with my full knowledge, but let's say it's not with my full knowledge, then now I'm starting to make decisions for others and their privacy. And I think that crosses a line on an ethical kind of stage, whether it's legal or not. And, some states it is, I believe, illegal to record people without notifying them ahead of time, at least auditorily. For some reason,
laws, I believe.
For some reason, visual is not included in that, but still. And so these devices, while maybe benign in intent for some, certainly has been used otherwise. I've read about the ones, the Meta glasses being used when these influencers go to rate restaurants, right? And then they record the waiter and stuff, but don't let the waiter know that they're being recorded. And so, to me, that crosses a line, because once again, you're violating the other's privacy, even if it's in a quote public setting, and then of course there's the legal versus like the ethical, moral aspect of things. And so I think that gets a lot messier when we start talking about those types of uses versus the personal wearable usage, where you're only recording your own information and you're not recording that of others. And then to me, that's a much easier lift, and that I would reckon we're going to see a lot more of the personal wearables catch on and being utilized. Whereas these sociable wearables, I think there's going to be lawsuits and all sorts of little things that are going to start popping up, or just the general disgust of the public of people who utilize these devices for that purpose. But it'll be interesting. Maybe it'll just become commonplace, and people are just going to always assume there's some AI overhearing us and transcribing us and capturing our images and likenesses and all of that. I don't know. It is a definite, when we dip our toes into technology, it's going to be a foolish endeavor to try to predict what's going to succeed and what's just going to flop. But right now, those sociables are flopping.
Yes. And as far as that goes, again, grateful that you called that out, and the importance that we as clinicians need to really kind of consider the liability, whether that is liability for our clients or liability for ourselves, and both, I guess, legal liability and ethical liability. So one of the things in preparation, Dan, you had created some just talking points. And I think one of the pieces of data that just kind of that came up with that is just, the ability to predict the potential of an increase in suicidality when it comes to changes in sleep patterns and those pieces. And that is fascinating. But wow, that is also scary as well. And like, as helpful as it on the surface that can be, if we are then endorsing an app and that app misses it, or, something happens, then what is the role? So, love technology, but also I think there has to be a healthy fear of technology, especially, if we're encouraging individuals to go and engage in something. I don't know that we will ever know the full ins and outs, but how do we have an understanding and making sure that we're not just using it as an easy button without really kind of doing our due diligence there, because that's a scary prospect of saying, hey, if you download this app and it's monitoring your sleep, that even if you've reported suicidal ID, it'll give us a warning, and so you get less worry or concerns in that way. So
yeah.
The implications that some of those pieces can bring in.
Yeah, I agree. I think it could be, we've been dealing with this since the mental health apps and maybe even before that. When you were talking, actually, what I was thinking about is the old suicide contracts, right? And how they got to be overused, right? The idea was, well, they signed the contract, so of course, then they're okay. Like, we don't need to take these other steps because, we got them to sign that. Like, that was somehow magical barrier that would prevent some sort of suicidal behavior. And so this is just a technological upgrade to maybe some of those contracts. The contracts themselves aren't bad. You just can't rely on them as the primary and maybe only preventative barrier from somebody completing a suicide. And it doesn't always have to be suicide, right? It could be any dangerous behaviors individuals engage in, to be totally reliant on technology to do the prevention. And that also, of course, requires a lot of vetting. The higher the level of risk that you're recommending something for, and then we got to get into the whole use of a third-party system, just like we do with our electronic medical records and anything else that's third-party that we use. That has to be vetted at some degree. And we also have to know that they retain the privacy, but also we need to have some assurance that this can be an effective thing, or at worst, do no harm to the individuals. Like, I don't think I would want to give, say, a calorie counter to somebody with an eating disorder. While yes, that might be very helpful in some ways, but for somebody with a particular mental health condition, that may end up being a disaster to recommend something like that to a person. And I guess the reason I mentioned eating disorders is that the eating disorder, the community that specializes in treating eating disorders is on it. They consistently, they have the most advanced, proven, researched apps on how to effectively do it. And they are really embracing AI and coming up with effective ways of treating that particular disorder. And I don't know what it is about that community of clinicians, but they are very tech forward and have found very promising results. It's just comes up surprisingly often for a disorder compared to other disorders out there to have a lot of tech apps and other things that are available to treat it. I'm not as aware of wearables specifically, but I think it goes to your further point of we shouldn't over rely, and we should always, as clinicians, and hopefully a network of clinicians, because there's just way too much of this apps and wearables and others out there for us to vet as individual therapists. That's just going to be too hard. So we have to rely on our organizations and others to really hopefully get a better handle on the stuff that's out there, and that we can use and have some good assurance that it's going to be providing some good information to folks.
I know I couldn't have said it better myself, Dan. And so just that call to awareness, as maybe tantalizing as technology can be of a tool, we need to make sure we're using it responsibly. And there's a lot of good and a lot of insight that can be gained, but doing so in a way that also isn't, being reckless, especially with our clients. So we want to provide the best care we can, and that means doing your due diligence. Dan, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation, and really, I find myself taking away a lot, both in our preparation, just hearing quite a bit, but also just even in the conversation, the way it unfolded. And believe you had said that you, with the research that you have done on the wearables, that there's an upcoming conference. You mind kind of sharing, if anyone happens to be attending the conference, they pick your brain at.
Yeah. It's a little conference called the American Psychological Association. So
May have heard of it, yeah.
You may have heard of it. Myself and some undergraduates at my university of Eastern Kentucky University are presenting a poster on our wearable efforts where we're using a smartwatch and looking at heart rate variability and its influence with anxiety and depression. So if people happen to be on a Friday around 10 o'clock in August at the APA convention, swing by the posters and you can meet me in person, or at least my undergraduates, and they can explain that particular study. But if nothing else, it is an exciting world to be looking into. And when you've got a little bit of research, it just kind of lets you have further appreciation of what it can do and what it also cannot do. So, yeah, thanks for the plug.
Absolutely. Hoping some of you there at home are able to go and follow up on this. But with that, we will be back in 2 weeks. But until then, be well, stay psyched.